left a message.
If it's not a ghost, what is it?
Ah, it's me. I'm Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, release stories, marketing stories, post-production stories, all those ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. Now, the films I tend to cover in this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, and it is an appreciation of just how hard it is to make a film, and gratitude, really, that films somehow manage to get through this whole system and complicated labyrinth of decisions that they all seem to have to go through. Without further ado, I'm going to start then with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. We're going a bit horror-y, we're going a bit spooky, we're going a bit bang in the night. Let me play you a clip. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
High-def camera on. My girlfriend Katie, she thinks there's something in the house. I don't know.
You believe me, right?
I think we're gonna have a very interesting time capturing whatever paranormal phenomena is occurring or is not occurring. Windows are locked, doors are locked, the alarm is on. Hearing a weird sound.
Something's here. I feel it breathing on me.
There's footsteps in, but there's no footsteps out.
Oh, God. Oh, my God.
If you do try to play games with it, that's inviting it in.
Now that then was a clip from 2007's Paranormal Activity, directed by Oren Peli, written by Oren Peli, starring Katie Featherston, Mika Slout, Mark Fredericks, Amber Armstrong and Ashley Palmer. And well, this is more a story of post-production than production, but let's go through let's go through the build-up to it. Because, I mean, if you once upon a time had, I'm going back for the computer nerds here, a Commodore Amiga computer, then you might have been exposed very early on to the work of filmmaker Oren Peli. Because as a youngster, he moved from Israel to America in his late teens, and he worked on a paint application program for the Amiga computer. He'd also move on to contribute to a couple of video games, the game Mortal Kombat 3. He's in there somewhere. And soon after moving to America, he was able to move into a house of his own. And as he explained to Moviefone in a long deleted interview, it was a bit of a moment when he got his own place. He said, like, when I moved into my house, he explained, it was the first time I lived in a detached family home as opposed to an apartment. And it's in a very quiet suburban neighbourhood. So you become very conscious of every little sound you hear because you don't have any neighbours above the walls, and basically you're not supposed to hear anything. And as he pointed out, when you do hear little creaks and knocks and stuff like that, you wonder what's going on. And most of it, natural sounds, the house just settling in the ground. But every once in a while, you'd hear things that would be weird and you couldn't figure out where they are. Now, after he moved into this house, I mean, Oren Peli wasn't a filmmaker per se. His industry was computing. That's where he was making his money. That's where he was making his living. And a lot of the times we talk about new and upcoming directors of having made their way up through short films, or they've gone to film school. And with Peli, that absolutely wasn't the case. He hadn't been to film school. He hadn't made short films. But what he did have was a computer and the knowledge of how to use the tools on said computer. So he had the apparatus by which to make a film, certainly to edit a film and to mix a film. He just hadn't done one. And so he started noodling with this. And as he considered his new empty house, he wondered what it would be like to set up cameras around the place and just see what's going on. The thing is, he didn't even do that. I mean, he just thought about it and wondered what had happened if he did. But then the thought came to him, was just like, well, what would happen if you then caught something on film? And he talked about this to the website Shock Till You Drop, and he said, I just thought it'd make a great movie. He said, I think a lot of people can relate to the question of what happens at night when you're most vulnerable. And he said, you've no idea what's going on. He said, this taps into the most primal fear. If something is lurking in your home and there's not much you can do about it. And so what do you know, Oren Peli decided he was going to try his hand at making a film, but it was still going to take a bit of time to do so. And in this case, the pre-production of the film was going to be a weighty amount of time. In fact, in this particular film story, we're going to have a weighty post-production, a weighty pre-production, and one of the quickest shoots we've ever covered on this podcast. But as he explained again to Shot Till You Drop, he just said that pre-production period involved a lot of research. And he explained it's the first film he'd made, and he knew he wanted to do it properly, but also he knew that he was going to direct it, he was going to edit it, he was going to audio mix it, he was going to do the casting. Basically, in his words, everything including getting the house ready, which took about a year just to get it into place that he could shoot a movie in the home in which he was living. And so he said, I read a lot of books on the subject too. Many interviews, accounts of exorcism, stories about haunted homes, all accounts on the topic. And he said, so now I have a large library about every angle of haunting, possessions and exorcisms. And he said he got his hands on everything. From my research, I learned the more violent entities are demonic, and we wanted to be as truthful as we could be. And so to help him get this film together, he enlisted his girlfriend at the time, he enlisted his best friend. There was no movie set. This was going to be in his house. And in the end, he did spend on a couple of things. He brought in makeup artist, but for the original shoot, it was a couple of actors and friends and family just helping through it. And even then, not many of them. Now, he knew he did need actors for this, and he would explain to the Los Angeles Times that he interviewed a few hundred people before finally meeting the two that he settled on to lead the movie, Katie Featherston and Mika Slout. And this was going to be quite a job for them because they weren't just going to be acting in the movie, they were effectively going to be part shooting it at various points throughout it as well. But in 2006, with a $15,000 bill, really, for the first run of the film, Oren Peli was ready to go. And he'd built up his pre-production that he was giving himself 7 days maximum to shoot the film. It had to be up and running and completed within 1 calendar week. And he was working too with limited equipment. He only had 2 cameras. He had 1 location. Now, on the flip side of that, most of the camera work for the shoot itself was fixed, that he would be able to mount a camera somewhere and just leave it running. Occasionally, some camera work was going to have to be done by the actors, but this was going to have an element of found footage to it. Obviously, something that the Blair Witch Project had turned into a phenomenon, but Paranormal Activity was just going to take a slightly different approach to that. Across that week of filming, Oren Peli shot an awful lot of footage. There were some nights where he just left the camera running all night and got a load of background material. And it built up to, by the time he was getting to a point of editing the movie, he had some 60, 70 hours of material to work with. The actors, for their part, as well as holding cameras where necessary, they didn't actually have a script. They didn't have lines written to say. Instead, what Oren Peli did with them was he explained the broad strokes of what was going to happen, and they would have to come up with their dialogue for certain scenes on the spot. That they knew the framework that they were going to be working within, but still they had to explore within that framework. And then just to wrap it all up, when it came to concluding the movie, Peli shot a number of different endings for the film, not particularly sure how it was going to conclude. There is a myth that he's talked about in interviews about just how many endings were shot. A lot were talked about and weren't actually completed. But the bottom line was, in 2006, Oren Peli had shot this film in 1 week for $15,000, and now he had to load it into his computer and work his way around it. Now, what links the two films we're talking about in this episode of Film Stories is, to a degree, they were both found ultimately in the post-production period, But the first pass at putting a cut of this together was firmly in Pelly's hands, and I talked to him about this just around the time of the release of the film, and he explained to me that he got hold of a copy of the Sony Vegas editing software. It wasn't even the most expensive video editing software he was working with. He said, I did some research into which editing programs were easier to learn, and a lot of people recommended it. He said it felt very natural and intuitive, so I trained myself to edit and worked out what I could do on my own and then set the story around it. He also used a free piece of sound software called Audacity just to help with some of the audio side, although most of the audio mixing he did within this Sony Vegas program as well. And he confessed this whole process took him around a year, but it was a year in which he was bringing people in to take a look. He said, during the time that I was editing the film, I was showing different rough cuts to people, and he noted that early on it kind of touched a nerve, and I noted people were responding extremely. They were saying it was giving them nightmares, and they were not able to sleep. But even so, it wasn't going to come any quicker than he could make it, because he still had to pay the bills. Around the time that he was editing this film, he still had a full-time job. And so as much as he was fine-tuning and timing and figuring out pacing and an awful lot of trial and error in the process, because again, he'd never done this before, he also had to go to work and bring in the bills. And so it got it to a point, though, where a year down the line, we're in 2007 now, the first cut of Paranormal Activity would debut at a festival. And it was accepted at the Screamfest Festival, debuted on October the 14th, 2007. But unusually, we're still years away from the wide release of the film. That said, that debut screening went down well, and crucially, it got him noticed by one of Hollywood's highest profile talent agencies, CAA, Creative Artists Agency, to the point where CAA signed Oren Peli up and then started sending out DVDs of the film to high profile people around town. Now, one of the first people to notice the film in the aftermath of this effort was a man called Steven Schneider, the producing partner of a man called Jason Blum. Now, Jason Blum at this stage is known in Hollywood as the producer of lots of low-budget films that make huge amounts of money through his Blumhouse production company, notable for keeping costs low so that people get creative control over their projects. But at this stage, Jason Blum wasn't really at Jason Blum level, for want of a better way to put it. I mean, he produced The Reader at this stage. I mean, he'd been helpful in bringing the others to the screen, but this wasn't the man who was overseeing lots of horror movies in and every year. But still, Blum watched Paranormal Activity on the recommendation of Snyder, and the pair felt the film deserved a distributor and started working with Oren Peli. And then they tried to get it into the Sundance Film Festival in 2008, but Sundance turned it down, and the genre festival Slamdance alongside it picked it up. But even at this stage, nobody was really volunteering to distribute the film. It was just another quietly effective horror, that low-budget horror that would find some audience, but not a massive one. And so let me throw in another instrumental name into this story, and this is Ashley Brooks, and she was a production executive working at DreamWorks. Now, DreamWorks towards 2007, 2008, well, the dream had gone a little bit. This was a studio set up in a blaze of publicity by Steven Spielberg, David Geffen and Jeffrey Katzenberg. DreamWorks Animation was going great guns. DreamWorks Live Action Pictures, I mean, they'd won Best Picture Oscars for Gladiator and American Beauty. But the times were getting a little bit tougher, but still DreamWorks had a live action outlet, was partnering with Paramount Pictures for distribution of its films. And so Ashley Brooks had a look at the film and really loved it. And it wasn't just that she loved it, she was badgering other people at DreamWorks up the chain of DreamWorks to watch the film, and more did so. And it was by early 2008 that Steven Spielberg had taken delivery of a disc, and he watched the film. And as the Los Angeles Times reported, he said not long after he watched it, the door to his empty bedroom inexplicably locked from the inside, forcing him to summon a locksmith. DreamWorks at this stage was already keen, but now so was Steven Spielberg. But the problem was the DreamWorks ideal, or a creative studio owned by the artist, was slowly falling apart at this stage. That the idea of a brand new studio had been bold, but it was difficult. And by 2008, DVD income was collapsing. And whilst overseas box office was growing, one wasn't really catering for the loss of the other. And so talks began with Paramount about just buying DreamWorks entire. But still, in the midst of all of this, DreamWorks did pick up Paranormal Activity. I mean, it was a relatively cheap acquisition, but the idea that it had was not to distribute the film. In fact, when it picked up Paranormal Activity, it had no intention at all of putting it into cinemas. Instead, what it wanted to do was do a higher budget remake that Oren Peli could come in and direct it. That would be fine. And then they would release his original film as a DVD extra. Now, Jason Blum and Oren Peli, though, already knew that the movie was playing much better in a cinema than it was on a television. And so they wrote a crucial piece of language into the deal that was inked with DreamWorks for the rights to Paranormal Activity. And that was, before it started work on a remake, DreamWorks had to hold one Paranormal Activity test screening just to see how it played Oren Peli's cut of the movie. Now, that screening took place in March 2008. And again, this was another turning point on the path of this particular film. That it didn't immediately look like it was going to be a turning point. That test screening, people just got up and walked out, and the worst was feared, and DreamWorks executives are just like, oh, well, they're just walking out, they just don't like it. But that's not why they were walking out. The thing was, the people who were leaving were just scared, petrified in a couple of cases. And so even by the end of that screening, a realisation was dawning that this was really chilling people. This was freaking people out. And that idea of doing a remake was junked. And instead, let's release this film, but just rework it a bit, spend a bit more money on the post-production, and let's see if we can come up with a new ending. In fact, Steven Spielberg himself would have suggestions for how to end the movie. But just as the road was clearing, the DreamWorks and Paramount situation came up again, and it left the film stuck in limbo just at the point where it looked like DreamWorks was pressing ahead with it. And so it stuck for 8 months while two corporate conglomerates effectively fought it out. And while that was playing out, well, the international rights were shortly going up for sale. And it was in November 2008 that the non-American distribution rights, the 52 separate deals around the world, were sold off in little under 24 hours after they were put up for sale. And they'd done the same thing. They'd put on a screening. The screening had gone down sensationally well. Arms had been snapped off to get hold of rights for territories around the world. And the word was really building on this. Because by now, there had just been a few isolated screenings of Paranormal Activity. There'd been that initial one back in 2007. And now word of this test screening, and now word of this screening for potential overseas investor. And the word of mouth was growing. And, you know, the internet is not very good at keeping secrets. And it was just like, actually, there's this really scary film that's doing the rounds, but how do we see it? Against this, though, Paramount was still a little bit nervous that in 1999 the Blair Witch Project had come out and had proven to be a viral sensation. It had been powered by the internet to become the most profitable independent film of all time at that stage. But lots of people had tried to replicate the success of the Blair Witch Project. They'd tried to replicate the found footage phenomenon. They'd tried to replicate the viral marketing. And the thing is, they'd pretty much all come up short. The Blair Witch Project was standing out as an outlier because it was just that, an outlier. It was the freak success. And so Paramount had no assumption that Paranormal Activity would do anything close to that, that it got the distribution rights after the kerfuddle with DreamWorks had played out. But still, it just had a mixed confidence on it. Now, firmly in Paramount's corner on this was it had achieved a viral marketing success, actually, the year before with the release of the Matt Reeves film produced by J.J. Abrams, Cloverfield. And that had been very, very cleverly marketed. I mean, the title was one of the last things to be released on that. A trailer was out before we got the title of it. And so it knew that it could push a film like this out, and also it was a genre film too, but also it just wanted to create a demand for it. And so what the studio decided to do is hedge its bets a little bit, that it entered it into festivals, the Telluride Film Festival, put it into the Toronto Film Festival, didn't enter them into the competition elements of these festivals, but just put screenings in and around them just to try and build that word of mouth again. But time had moved on. I mean, these screenings were being set start up in the autumn of 2009. So we're now 2 years after the first release of the film, the first screening of the movie, but now the ending had been reworked. 6 figures had been spent on the post-production of the movie when 5 figures were spent on the production of the movie. And it played at Telluride, it played at Toronto. And then, as Megan Colligan, the then marketing co-president of Paramount, explained to the Los Angeles Times, if you get enough interest and it catches on and really works, you could use demand for 2 or 3 weeks in October. Now, demand was a service whereby fans could demand a screening. That instead of a cinema having to take on the risk of just putting a screening on and hoping people turned up, what happens in theory was that 50 people would sign up and say, we want a screening of it at that film. Because there's enough interest, a screening would be arranged. And so that was the way that Paramount was looking in the initial stages to roll this film out, just to see if there really was that word of mouth converting into people willing to hand over a few dollars to watch the film. And so, as Colligan explained, going this way, it allows us to be really responsive to what is actually happening. And it meant that by the end of September 2009, Paranormal Activity was just playing on a handful of screens around the US, with the idea then that what Paramount would do is it would take a slightly more traditional approach in October and get the reviewers in and then up the screen count by the end of October 2009 and then just see where it lands. What it also decided to do was keep the cast and writer, director, editor, sound mixer, Oren Peli out of the initial promotion push. Now, this is very much out of the Blair Witch Project marketing playbook. If you're being a phenomenon, a thing out of nowhere, you want to completely mystify as much as humanly possible, and you don't want actors just doing the interview circuit. And Oren Peli certainly felt no need either to be front and centre of the interviews. Instead, what was working were trailers and little promos and snippets just showing footage from the film. That and the building word of mouth that was coming from the isolated screenings that were being set up. Now, as the Los Angeles Times noted in its report just before the release of the movie, whilst it's highly unlikely Paranormal Activity can come close to the success of the Blair Witch Project, Oren Peli and Jason Blum hope the film can teach the old dogs of Hollywood a new trick. By this stage, it had cost $15,000 to make. The post-production of the movie had taken the cost up to around $250,000. This was still peanuts in the scheme of Hollywood. And when the film did go in front of reviewers, the reception to it was, it was strong. Some reviewers frowned on it, some really quite liked it. But by that point, it didn't really matter because the word of mouth had taken hold. So let's go to the box office chart, September the 25th to the 27th, 2009. You have to go right the way down to 48th place, where Paranormal Activity is playing on 12 screens in the US, a $77,000 opening weekend. Didn't have the biggest per screen taking average of the week either. I think films like Cocoon before Chanel were claiming that particular week. And so Paramount just stuck with its approach. So by week 2, Paranormal Activity had moved up to 33 screens, but tellingly, its screen average had doubled. It was now making $16,000 per screen, comfortably the highest in the chart, and $500,000 was in the bank now. So Paramount again just slowly ramped it up. 160 screens it went to in its third week, just 160 screens, and it made 4th place at the box office. And Paramount at that point, that was the validation that it absolutely had something. Its box office gross was up to $9 million. Couples Retreat was the number 1 movie that particular weekend. Zombieland was around. But now this phenomenon was building. And even though the marketing playbook really for modern movies is you open as big as possible because there's not the screen space to grow on word of mouth, Paranormal Activity was going the opposite way on that. Even in its 4th week, it was only playing on 760 screens as it went up to number 3 at the US box office, grossing $19 million in that 4th weekend alone. To put that into some context, the number 1 movie that weekend was Where the Wild Things Are, which grossed $32 million across 3,735 screens, nearly 3,000 more screens it was playing on. Paranormal Activity was getting $25,000 per screen average. That was a sensational number. And then finally, a month later, 5 weeks into its run, Paramount just took it wide, up the screen count to 1,945, and it went to number one at the box office, outgrossing that weekend's new opener, Saw 6. So Paranormal Activity took 21 million on its fifth weekend. Saw 6 opened with 14 million. And I mean, the phenomenon was confirmed, really. The following weekend, the money was still coming in, even though it was knocked off the top spot by the Michael Jackson project, This Is It. But by the time it concluded its US theatrical run, Paranormal Activity had banked $107.9 million off a production budget of $15,000. Outside of the US, it added another $85 million to its run. And so nearly $200 million in the bank, not far off those Blair Witch numbers at all. And the difference here is Paramount was able to franchise it a lot better than Artisan ever was with the Blair Witch Project. It wasn't just going to be one sequel we were going to get here. It was fairly clear we were, especially given that the Saw films at that stage had proven the model of a sequel every single year. It was clear that there was a lot more in Paranormal Activity. And producer Jason Blum, this was one of the key turning points in his career. Even though he would describe the subsequent Paranormal Activity 2 as one of the least fun films to make he'd ever experienced, the sequel nonetheless followed just 12 months later and proved a sensation again. Another 12 months later, there's Paranormal Activity 3. Another 12 months later, there's Paranormal Activity 4. We got Paranormal Activity, the marked ones, in 2014. Paranormal Activity, the Ghost Dimension, in 2015. Paranormal Activity, Next of Kin, in 2021. And even though there's talk now that the franchise is dormant, Jason Blum's given an interview that just says if someone comes up with a great idea for another one, they'll certainly look at it. Now, for Oren Peli, he hasn't really I mean, he didn't need to, really, but he's not really done an awful lot more since in terms of directing films himself. I mean, his second film, Area 51, would arrive in 2015, but he's just stayed as a producer on the Paranormal Activity films, and I'd imagine they have managed to pay a few of the bills as well. And then I asked him in the aftermath of the success of the first film, is this house, because he was still living in the house while the movie was number one at the box office, had that been attracting a lot of attention? Did all of a sudden people drive by in buses and take a look? And he just said, we did have a few when the movie came out, but just not that many. And he was able just to kind of just go back to some degree of normality, just with a far more flushed out bank account. In terms of the future of the Paranormal Activity films, as I said, it is a little bit up in the air. But from someone's front room and teaching himself how basically to make a film by wrestling computer programs and spending a year building it all up, and then more time afterwards building it all, putting it all together, a major international horror franchise was just spawned. A really unlikely one, but one that, I mean, is still, as much as people say otherwise, is still active to some degree. Will there be another movie? Almost certainly, I would suggest. Will there be another moment like the first one where, you just get exactly the right film at exactly the right time? Perhaps not in that franchise, but who knows? Maybe there's someone out there programming a painting application or a computer game who's just coming up with the next big, huge, viral indie movie success. If so, cut me in. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. If you like this podcast, there are 3 ways you can support it. I'm grateful to any / all of these. If you support it on Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew, you get the podcast early. You find out all the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. Also, you get it completely ad-free as well. I'm aware that adverts are slowly coming on this podcast. We've been really careful about where we place them. I hate podcasts flooded with too many adverts, but we're trying to do some fairly ambitious things with Film Stories and give lots of people lots of opportunity as well who perhaps ordinarily wouldn't get it. So that's where the Patreon money really goes. That's where any money from ads is really going as well. I wish it was going towards luxury holidays for me, but well, sadly not. I mean, although the West Midlands here in the UK is looking very glamorous today. Something that costs you absolutely nothing. Subscribe to the podcast at your podcast home of choice. That's hugely appreciated. And if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review. That helps us enormously too. It's all about algorithms and things I don't particularly understand, but all that kind of stuff, feeding all these systems seems to help. If you want to suffer my waffling live, I've got a live show coming up in Birmingham at the Midlands Arts Centre here in the UK. That is taking place on November the 2nd. I'll be telling some film stories. We'll be looking at the latest that's been going on in movie news. I'll have a couple of filmmaking guests along to that. Tickets are on sale now. You can find more details on that at filmstories.co.uk or just search the Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham. The show is called Movie Geek Live. But I think that's enough parish notices and stuff for this episode. I want to get on with the second one because now we're going back to the 80s to another film whose director said they pretty much found large chunks of it in post-production. Let me play you a clip. I'll come to the story of this one, the other side of it.
From the farthest corner of a distant galaxy and the deepest feelings of the human soul comes a fantasy to fill your heart.
I feel tremendous. I'm ready to take on the world. Ow! Ow!
It is everything you've dreamed of. It is nothing you expect.
Oh, I can keep a secret. I wouldn't tell anybody.
It's hard to know who to trust.
It is the mystery of an awesome secret. It is the miracle of everlasting life.
We'll never be sick. We won't get any older, and we won't ever die.
Well, that seems like a cheery place to leave that particular clip. That was from 1985's Cocoon, directed by Ron Howard. Screenplay credited to Tom Benedict, a story from David Saperstein, and starring Don Amici, Wilford Brimley, Hume Cronin, Brian Dennehy, Jack Guilford, Steve Guttenberg, Maureen Stapleton, Jessica Tandy, Gwen Verdon, Herta Ware and Taney Welsh. And common logic goes that if you want to have a big box office hit, you don't stuff your movie full of old people. That was how it was reported and how it was said at the time. And films led by older performance, well, there's still a degree of thinking that that's a road to box office poison. I personally don't buy it, never really did. Films of late, such as The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel films, Lady in the Van and things like that. I talked to a local multiplex manager near me and he says that's absolute gold to them. That's better than a Marvel film because they bring in people who ordinarily wouldn't go to a cinema. But nonetheless, this rule was still been adhered to a degree in the early 1980s. But that didn't stop a writer called David Saperstein working away on such an idea, a film based around a load of senior citizens who effectively are taken away by aliens. Now, Saperstein wrote this into a manuscript, and the unpublished novel was soon doing the rounds in Hollywood, where it came to the attention of producer Lily Finney Zanuck. Now, she was a producer who would go on to win an Academy Award for Driving Miss Daisy when that won the Best Picture Academy Award. And she was working with her husband, Richard D. Zanuck, on producing movies and generating movies. And they were also working with producer David Brown. They'd had a lot of joy where Richard D. Zanuck and David Brown had an awful lot of joy with a film called Jaws. I wonder what happened to that. But in this particular case, what Lily Finney Zanuck was trying to do was find material from writers who, well, just perhaps weren't as well known, who were struggling to break through. And so this particular project from David Saperstein came to the attention of Lily Finney Zanuck, and it bubbled up. And so the Zanucks at this point had a deal with 20th Century Fox, and they stumped up $7,500 at the end of the 1970s, early 1980s for a 12-month option on Saperstein's story. That said, Richard D. Zanuck and David Brown's immediate priority was a project called The Verdict, starring Paul Newman. But while that was going ahead, a screenplay was put together for Cocoon, even though it wasn't really a screenplay that passed an awful lot of muster with 20th Century Fox. And so what Lily Finney Zanuck decided to do was bring in another writer to have a go at that, and Tom Benedict was invited in to put together a draft, and he duly got to work. Now, again, not dissimilar to the other film story in this episode, there was a little bit of behind-the-scenes friction on this one, because the Zanucks had been working with producer David Brown, and their company had been attached to Fox for several years, but things weren't going well, and in 1982 they ended their long-standing deal and decided to go to Warner Brothers instead. However, the projects that they'd set up at 20th Century Fox were going to have to stay at 20th Century Fox, and thus Cocoon would stick with the Fox studio, But it was Zanuck and Brown who'd paid for those initial movie rights, that's $7,500. And so there's a bit of a standoff here that Fox couldn't make Cocoon without Zanuck, Brown and Zanuck, and they couldn't make Cocoon without Fox. And so what they did, I mean, after a little scuffle, is they worked out a deal whereby they would delay their departure to Warner Brothers, they'd return to Fox to make Cocoon, and then they would head off to the other studio. In the backdrop of all of this, there was actually a director already working on the movie as well. And this was an up-and-coming Hollywood director by the name of Robert Zemeckis. Now, he was in the early stages of his career here, and he'd just done a pair of films on the trot that, let's be blunt about it, had not done great guns at the box office. One of them was I Wanna Hold Your Hand. The other was Used Cars, which is a movie that's had a much nicer reappraisal in recent times. But the bottom line in the early 1980s is both of them had flopped, and neither of them were leading to studios beating a path to Robert Zemeckis' door. However, the old adage is you get your new project set up before your old one's done. And so he was already working on his next movie by the time Used Cars had failed at the box office. And that film was for 20th Century Fox. It was a movie called Romancing the Stone. Remember that? And so he jumped into shooting that in 1983. But it was an uneasy relationship between Fox and Zemeckis on that production. And it really wasn't helped too that the studio didn't like an early cut of the movie that he presented to them. And the feeling in the Fox boardroom was that Robert Zemeckis just didn't have the box office touch, that they got the wrong person for Cocoon. And so they basically fired him from the movie. That by the start of 1984, even before Romancing the Stone had been released in cinemas, Fox was so certain that film was going to stumble that it decided it didn't want to be in the Robert Zemeckis business, got rid of him from Cocoon, and went looking for a replacement. Now, of course, Zemeckis would have a very, very sizable last laugh here, that Romancing the Stone would prove to be the biggest hit of the year for Fox in 1984 and would dwarf so many more of the other projects of which there were higher expectations for. And instead of doing Cocoon, he would go off to make another film called Back to the Future instead. And in fact, there was the chance that Back to the Future's release would end up clashing with Cocoon as well. So Zemeckis and Fox were still on some degree of a collision course, albeit that was a collision course that was ultimately averted. So, who's going to direct Cocoon then? Well, it wasn't that long a search, because off the back of the success of Splash, an actor turned director by the name of Ron Howard was very much on his way up. And he was already juggling other potential projects. In fact, he was looking at projects for Fox as well. And so Robert J. Emery's done a collection of books called The Directors. And in The Directors Take One, there are several interviews with Ron Howard based in and around the making of Cocoon. And he admits, Howard does, that when he got hold of the latest draft of the screenplay by Tom Benedict, he just wasn't really sold on it. The screenplay wasn't gelling. But what was the whole central conceit of it. The idea of aliens abducting senior citizens. And there was just something to it. And Howard, after mulling this for a while, was inclined to make it his next movie. But he was going to attach conditions to it. So Splash had been an enormous hit, and that meant he had some clout and he had some power, and he didn't just have to take the contract as presented to him, and he didn't. He wanted to make sizable changes to the screenplay before he would agree to roll cameras on Cocoon. And his involvement in the film was announced on March the 14th, 1984, that this was going to be the movie he was going to take. Fox took those conditions. And so he and Cheryl Howard, his wife, went through the film, and they started doing what would be a fairly hefty, uncredited rewrite of the movie. And so they were working on fleshing out the characters quite a lot of this one. And in fact, they put quite a lot of character work in, too much, as we're about to find out when it hit post-production. Howard had got a good deal to make this one as well. I mean, he was getting $1 million to direct, plus he'd take a share of any profits as well. And Fox had allocated a budget of some $13 million to the movie, although it would rise up to some $17 million by the time filming was complete and the film was out in cinemas. Because there's a sci-fi angle to Cocoon, Fox was also very aware that there was going to be some special effects required of this, both special and visual effects, and this would involve the company Industrial Light and Magic. I'll name check them again a little bit later. And so casting was underway, and a whole bunch of senior actors were attracted to the movie. People as far and wide as Don Ameche, Wilford Brimley, Jack Gilford, Maureen Stapleton, Jessica Tandy. I mean, a lot of Hollywood royalty was drawn to a project like this, but there weren't many Hollywood commercial projects of this ilk, and certainly none that were bringing together such a senior ensemble. I think it's quite telling that when Fox finally released a poster for the movie, none of the names were on it. They didn't think they had movie star firepower here, but what they certainly had was an awful lot of acting talent. What they also had was a young upcoming actor by the name of Steve Guttenberg, who, I mean, Police Academy was a real breakthrough for him. And so Guttenberg talks about the film quite a lot in his own memoir, The Guttenberg Bible. And he talks there about how he got sent the script from his agent. And his agents really weren't keen. As he wrote, this film is about old people and no one wants to see a movie about old people. That's what one of the top film agents in the office told me as he was handed the screenplay. And so he sort of was interested in it, and there were people in the office who wanted him to do it, but the senior agent at his reps was against it. Who's going to see this? Cocoon. What's a cocoon? And she said, I say you do something with more zing to it than this one. But Guttenberg was intrigued, and he read the script, and he took a meeting with Ron Howard, with Richard D. Zanuck, with Lily Finner-Zanuck, and he was aware that Ron Howard was coming off a hit movie. And as Guttenberg observed, I really believed he was going to be a superstar. As he writes in his book, he had such a presence the second you met him. His grasp of movie making was masterful, and he described the making of the film with as much vision as it probably takes to put someone in space. Guttenberg added that Dick and Lily were enthusiastic and focused on the movie and making it a hit. He wasn't the only person up for the youngest lead role in the movie either. The other candidate for it was a young upcoming actor by the name of Nicolas Cage. Again, what happens to these people? I just mentioned them. They just disappear out of history. But it was Guttenberg that Howard and the producers were moving towards. And in the end, Guttenberg signed up. I mean, he was really interested in it. But also, Ron Howard still wasn't thrilled with the script. And so Cheryl and Ron Howard just kept tuning it. And they knew on paper that this wasn't a commercial idea, that they knew that they were going to do, even as they went into it, there's no guarantee this was going to be a hit. So they just tuned it to make the character-driven drama that they wanted it to be. Now, Guttenberg describes at the point where people were starting to come together that, and the Howards were rewriting the script right through rehearsals as well, that a table read was assembled, and he said there sat Don Ameche, Wilford Brimley, Brian Dennehy, Hume Cronin, Jack Gilford, Jessica Tandy, Gwen Verdon. Tani Welsh sat down at the end, and there was my seat next to hers, and he just described it as hundreds of years of talent sitting there. Now, there was one thing at the table read that Steve Guttenberg had to do, and he wasn't able to get out of it because the script at one stage calls for him basically to mime having an orgasm, one of those. And so he was quite shy about doing this in front of them all, and says, we'll do that when it comes to shooting. But no, they weren't having that. The cast egged him on, and he complied. And as he wrote, Jessica Tandy made a few catcalls, and Gwen whooped it up. Everyone was laughing. We all had a good time with it. And that moment was a bonding one, he said. Everyone was looking forward to seeing how he was going to do that particular moment on the screen. And as Maureen Stapleton would add, if you can do that halfway, I've got a hotel key with your name on it, kid. So that's not a bad start, is it? Now, by 20th of August 1984, the cast and crew were in the Bahamas. That Howard had brought them out early for quite a lot of rehearsal, really. And that rehearsal period also afforded the cast lots of dinners, lots of time to work things out. And then when it got to the shoot proper, Howard then tried to stick to 12-hour working days. But he was also up against a lot of actors who had very different styles and a whole load of experience. He'd actually worked with Bette Davis just on a previous television project, and had some backwards and forwards with her before they'd found a way of working together that actually worked out really well. But as Howard described in Robert Emery's book, on the one hand, you've got someone like Wilford Brimley, who was in his late 40s, playing a role some 20, 25 years older, who improvises a lot, lot, and Howard says subscribes to no film technique at all. On the other hand, you've got a classically trained someone. You've got Don Amici, who hits his mark, says his line, and goes home. Jack Gilford is described as an old song and dance man. And here was a young director in the midst of an experienced ensemble, just trying to find some cohesiveness. How do you work with everyone? How do you get their trust and respect? But that said, Howard admitted too that he was less intimidated by working with those actors than he was with working with power producers Richard D. Zanuck and David Brown, because of course the shadow of Jaws was over them, and by this stage as well the verdict had turned into a success as well, and these were high-powered Hollywood producers as well. Now, the shoot itself didn't go off completely without incident that Steve Guttenberg describes in his book, One Night, where he went out with a cast member who he doesn't name in the book, but I mean, it doesn't take much press reports to work out it was Brian Dennehy. They went out drinking. Quite a lot of drinking, to the point where they were pulled over for drink driving, and it was Dennehy in the driver's seat. And so the following day, I mean, they just tried to play it cool and go in, but unbeknownst to Guttenberg, the story was in all the newspapers, and Ron Howard called him over and said just what happened, frankly knowing most of what had happened, because here they were in a relatively small community, they were the big movie shooting there, and so everybody knew. Now, interestingly as well, Guttenberg talks about, as much as it was a happy set, that there was one actor who was asked to leave the set on the last day after he and the first assistant director nearly came to blows. And this was over. Guttenberg describes how the most irritating thing to certain actors is being called to the set, and then you have to hang around for hours because you've been called at basically the wrong time and there's nothing for you to do. And the actor in question, who wasn't named, I can't reiterate that enough, just continually, it was just building and building and building. It kept happening to them, and so it got to the point where this exploded on their final day of shooting. So they didn't get the big farewell, but production wrapped up other than that fairly amiably on the 1st of November 1984. Fox at this stage was looking at putting the movie out at Christmas 1985, but it also figured that Christmas 1985 was going to be tough. I mean, it had Romancing the Stone 2 lined up at that point, a film called Jewel of the Nile, which I've talked about on a previous episode of this podcast. And so what it decided to do was move it away from the seasonal competition, and Cocoon would now be going out in cinemas in June of 1985. Now, summer 1985, I mean, it's not blockbuster season in the way that we know it now, but it's still fairly high profile. And Howard was in the editing room trying to put this together with his editing team of Daniel P. Hanley and Mike Hill. And the problem they got was they had a first cut of the film that was actually really quite tight, but it was still over 3 hours long because they'd really gone in with the character work on there. And as much as the producer liked that cut and Howard liked that cut as well, they knew they couldn't put this out in cinemas at 3 hours, and they knew they had to get it down. And Hanley and Hill worked with Howard over a period of 2 weeks, just chopping the film down to a length that cinemas would be happy to play. And Howard would say of his time on Cocoon, I learned that you could really make over a film in post-production, that he did change it quite a lot. He changed it when he was reworking the script, and then he'd given himself that many options in the editing room that he was able to fashion a dramatically different cut of the film. Now, against this, Fox started testing the movie because it was a relatively contracted post-production period they had. There was 7-8 months on this. And the testing was going really, really well. The numbers were high. And it got to the point where they were filming special trailers for certain waves of publicity and ways that they were approaching the release of the film, because the studio knew it had something that actually really could work. And as Guttenberg described, when a studio has a hit or suspects it has a hit, the sky's the limit on what it can do, how much it can gross, then how well it can pick up the ancillary monies. And a hit pays for a lot of flops. Fox was sensing it had something here and was putting the money in and was putting the extra trailers in and was putting the extra work in. And so the film, a final cut of 117 minutes, went before critics in the summer of 1985, and it got a lot of goodwill, really. I mean, the sweetness of the movie was particularly praised, and also the novelty. It shouldn't be a novelty, but it was still a novelty the novelty of having just this old ensemble, seeing all these senior actors just doing what they do really, really well. And that was really appreciated by a lot of people. So it wasn't getting outright rave reviews, but it was certainly getting positive ones. And that all boded well for Fox as it unleashed the movie into cinemas in June of 1985. And what do you know? Opened in first place at the box office too, with a $7.9 million opening weekend, dislodging the previous week's number one, which was Rambo First Blood Part 2. The other films that were around that had opened the same month, The Goonies was in the top 5. Life Force, remember that? The first Fletch movie, Princess Honor. Return to Oz. Oh, there's a nice cheery film to watch with the kids, good lord. A View to a Kill was in the top 10 still. Brewster's Millions. Secret Admirer rounded out the chart. And Cocoon would just continue to do good business. I mean, it was knocked off the top of the chart the week after by Clint Eastwood with Pale Rider, and Back to the Future in the end arrived in the summer of 1985 and then opened with $11 million, and so Robert Zemeckis was doing really very nicely, thank you. But then so was Ron Howard. I mean, Cocoon went up a place on its fourth week of release. Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome was about around there. And by the time it had completed its run in US cinemas, it had put $76 million in the bank off what turned into a $17.5 million budget. One where some of that money had to be spent, the extra money spent on the special effects that were being done on set and the visual effects work that ILM was doing in post-production. And that's something that was far more of a novelty then than, I mean, we just kind of take it for granted now. Outside of the US, I mean, it didn't do enormous numbers outside of the US. I think about another $10 million, but still a comfortable profit for Fox. $85 million banked off its cinema run. It will go on to do good business on video as well. I remember videos. And also talk surfaced fairly quickly as well about a sequel. But before that, there was the small matter of the Academy Awards, because Cocoon picked up a couple of nominations, and more than that, he picked up a couple of gongs. That Don Ameche, in spite of never being nominated for an Oscar in his life, was put up for Best Actor in a Supporting Role and won it. And the visual effects too, names such as David Berry, Scott Farrer, Ralph McQuarrie and Ken Ralston, they took home the Best Visual Effects Oscar in 1985 as well. And so a couple of Oscars, a box office hit, and Ron Howard's star would continue to rise off the back of that as well, although he would follow up doing Cocoon by putting his efforts into a film called Gung Ho that didn't quite go as well. But it's all mitigated for him by, in the end, he would turn into, of course, one of Hollywood's highest profile directors and has a Best Director Oscar on his mantelpiece for his work on A Beautiful Mind that will follow some way down the road. The Cocoon story is rounded out though by the fact that Fox wanted a sequel, and Richard Zanuck, David Brown and Lily Finney Zanuck were keen for a sequel as well, and the core cast were going to come back with the addition of Courtney Cox in the mix there as well. Ron Howard wouldn't return for this one, and instead Daniel Petrie, the father of Daniel Petrie Jr., who directed Toy Soldiers, who I talked about in the last episode of Film Stories, Daniel Petrie would take over the director's chair for 1988's Cocoon the Return, which again got fairly okay-ish reviews, although this time the box office magic was gone, despite costing again $17.5 million to make. This time it only bring in $25 million, so the numbers were down by about 2/3 really this time round. And I don't know if there were ever any plans for Cocoon 3 back in training or something along those lines, but it'd be fair to say that the box office grosses for the second movie pretty much pay for that. However, we did get the original, and the original continues. I mean, it continues to have a life out there, even though it's one of the tougher hit movies of the 80s to find on disc formats and on streaming for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Nonetheless, there's proof that, as there always is if you look in the history of cinema, that you don't just have to put young people in films and get a box office hit. Sometimes bring a load of senior actors together, let them do their stuff. Might be a bit of money in that too. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for your time, thank you for listening, and it's much, much appreciated. If I have not bored you to death, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Our website, filmstories.co.uk, is updated every weekday with news, reviews, features, details of upcoming shows there as well. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you'll find our magazines for sale. Loads of print magazines that we make here, including Film Junior as well for under 15s. We also have a Sneakers Blu-ray we made here in the UK with fresh extra features on that as well. We are on YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories. There's more stuff coming there very shortly. And I think that's it, really. I think I've waffled on far too much, as always. The main thing is you all look after yourselves. You all take care. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Look after yourselves. Bye-bye.